Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Beneath the Red Star podcast, a Russian history podcast for normal people. As always, I'm your host, Kyle, and today we're embarking on our second episode on the life and times of Grigory Rasputin. And since we already know what we're talking about, well, I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in. So, where we left off last time, Rasputin had just met with the Tsar and Tsarina for the first time through a connection with the Tsar's sister-in-law. But before we can talk about that more, we need to discuss a little bit of the background. Because I imagine that we more or less already kind of know where this is going, and if not, well, spoiler alert, the Tsar and Tsarina are absolutely taken with Rasputin, and Rasputin becomes a central figure within the Tsar's court. And this is not a private thing. This is not some weird backroom like, oh, Rasputin is like a myth that maybe no one's really seen, or no. Everyone knows about the guy. Their connection is very public. It's really well known. But before we can talk about that, and well before any of that all happened, well before Rasputin and the Tsar met each other, and well before either one of them probably knew the other one existed, or, well, I guess probably Rasputin knew the Tsar existed, because he was kind of, the ruler of the country and all, but you know what I mean. Before all of that, we need to talk about the religious and kind of spiritual state of Russia. So, we're going back to the year 1875. In 1875, a woman named Helena Blavatsky published an article that coined the term occultism. Quick little note here. Blavatsky did not invent the occult, and she did not invent the practices that she defines as occultism. She was just the one who came up with the name, and also just so happened to be an incredibly important and popular figure in the occultist movement, and was a very central figure to the spread of occultism in the late 19th and early 20th century. So, what is occultism? Well, it's exactly what you think it is. It's seances and Ouija boards and spooky rituals. It's crystals, sage, ghosts, black cats, and, all of that shit. And occultism and Helena Blavatsky would become incredibly popular, and actually incredibly powerful, as we'll see here in a little bit. We are not going to go into Blavatsky a whole lot here, unfortunately, but she is a really, really interesting character, and a very important one, really. And she deserves her own episode because she was a major leader in the occultism movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And though she lived in New York when she got really famous, she is Russian by birth, and so hey, that's enough for me to call her Russian history. But anyways, I digress. Occultism, also known as spiritualism or mysticism, caught on incredibly quickly in the United States and in Europe. But where did occultism come from? The answer to this question is more or less one that focuses on a crisis in Christianity that was going on at the time. Basically, people were becoming less religious and were seeking other ways of understanding the world. This mostly centered around two issues. One, people were not really comfortable with the concept of eternal damnation and the general uncertainty of what happens when you die. There's particularly an issue that people are not super into the, hey, you're going to go to hell, because they're like, what? I'm a good person. I know other people who are good people, and that doesn't really sit well with me. And this is, of course, a kind of central issue within Christianity and has been forever and still is today. So people wanted some kind of answer to what happens when you die, and can, good people end up in hell? Like my grandpa. He was great. Where the hell is he? Hopefully not actually in hell. The other issue was one of science. And that issue was kind of that science was disproving a lot of aspects of Christian ideology. Particularly two things. One, evolution. Evolution is getting really big at the time and seems to kind of be disproving certain things like intelligent design, and actually ties in really well with the second issue that people were having within the kind of science-osphere. And that was, the Earth is seemingly much, much, much older than anyone had previously understood, and is certainly much older than it kind of seems to be in the Bible. So, where people are looking for guidance, where people are looking for answers, occultism offered those answers. Are you unsure what happened to your grandpa? Well, for $4.99 a minute, I'll let you talk to him. You can ask him how he's doing. Says he's doing great. Says he misses you. People like that. The world millions of years old? Well, maybe there were things on this planet beyond our comprehension. Maybe there were ghosts, spirits, demons, who knows? Well, okay, to be fair on that one, dinosaurs were like a really big thing, and they were very new at the time, and they were absolutely blowing people's minds. I mean, to be fair, I've known about dinosaurs my entire life, and sometimes that still kind of blows my mind. 65 million years ago, these giant lizards lived on this planet. And at the time, there was a lot of dead space of, well, how old are even human beings? How far back does civilization and society go? Could there be, maybe there were, I don't know, other folks living on this planet, other beings, things that we could tap into, devils, demons, who knows, man. Basically, this is something that there's a lot of dead space in that science has opened up, and the occult comes in to say, you're looking for an answer? Well, boy, howdy, I got one. Especially because the people doing this stuff, they're doing it for money. They are, not like, oh, I'm a preacher or whatever, and I'm living a life of austerity, or I have the church backing me, or any of this stuff. No. These mystics, these occultist types, they're doing this for money. So, if you walk into their parlor and are asking them things like, hey man, is my grandpa dead in hell? Well, they can give you an answer, and they can, set up a meeting so you can talk to him. Or, you got questions about the age of the world? Awesome. I can just make some random shit up and say, it's the knowledge of the ancients, ooh! And it worked. But, as you might expect, the Christian religions of the world were not exactly excited about this. The occult and spiritualist movements were seen as paganistic and heretical. And, to be fair, a lot of these movements were, at least advertised to be anyways, based on pagan practices. There was kind of a, we are reaching back to the ancients and the old ways, the stuff that has been lost to time, the way that the folks, our ancestors, millions of years ago would do it, and they would talk to God or devils, demons, religious figures of all shapes and sizes. You get the picture. There's a lot of malarkey going on in these spiritual groups, but they do tend to work really well because they are boiling down a lot of things from other ideologies. They're basically taking a lot of things that are kind of fleshed out in other places, particularly like Buddhism and Hinduism, and bringing them here. This is like the introduction of karma to the United States, Russia, Western Europe, the whole 9 yards, all of this area. Places where these weren't really ideas that were super popular before, which kind of lends a certain amount of credence and, I guess, legitimacy because, one, you don't need to come up with like a logical conclusion. This other religion you're stealing the idea from already has. And two, it lends that credence of, well, all these people over there have this religion, so it's not just like, oh, I just fucking pulled this out of a hat, even though maybe I did. It has that idea of, no. There's a whole religion over there. Millions of people are into it, so I can't just be making this shit up. And it worked. But, again, the church was not exactly a big fan of this, and the church cracked down on occult and spiritualist groups and on the people pushing spiritualism and occultism. But that in itself really didn't work out. In fact, as often happens, occultism became wrapped up into many people's Christian beliefs. And occult ideas can still be seen in mainstream Christian sects to this day. Particularly things about, like, say, blood sacrifice and our kind of modern conception of ghosts. They're coming from this time period. And basically, what they're doing is they're weaving in both kind of the individual who's being told this stuff, as well as the person who's going out selling it. They're weaving in Christian and non-Christian ideas together in a kind of made-up, fake, forced religious syncretism. Which religious syncretism is basically when two religions interact, they will share bits and pieces with each other because, these ideas can mesh, and the people who are exposed to both will ultimately mesh them themselves. But this is kind of synthetic. It's kind of forced because the people pushing this, they're not pushing like a real religion. They're pushing something that they made up. But it still works the same way. The people who are pushing occultism and mysticism and spiritualism and all that, they understand their audience. They understand that they are pushing this onto a Christian audience, and a lot of the people who are pushing it are themselves Christian. And so they realize that, much in the same way if I can say, oh, well, this is from Buddhism, or this is from Hinduism, or this is from Taoism, or Shinto, like whatever, that does lend it some credence, they also understand that if I can link it to the Bible, if I can link it to Jesus, if I can link it to God somehow, if I can link it to our modern for the 19th century, modern concepts of Christianity and of religion, you're going to get a lot more traction with people. And then as well, the folks who are taking it in, they are already seeing things from a God kind of point of view. They're already seeing things from a New Testament mindset. So when they're taking in these new things, this isn't necessarily to completely supplant Christianity, it's just to fill in gaps. And so that's what they did. And ultimately, you end up with a lot of people who have very, very devout Christian beliefs, but also are mixing in these spiritualist ideas to kind of create a better picture for themselves. One that makes a little bit more sense than just what they can find in the Bible. But even though it really kind of, in the end, doesn't take away a ton of authority and power from the church, as we've seen today, it can actually work really well as a part of the church. The church was really concerned about it. All the churches all over the world were, all of the Christian sects were like, hey guys, this is kind of a big deal and we don't like it. And a lot of them were worried that the occult was the will of the devil and that it was a direct threat to the stability of the planet and, of course, the souls of the people living on it. The Russian Orthodox Church, believe it or not, was no different. At the very least, occult religions were a direct threat to the power and control that the church exercised over the country. See, that's one of the things that's kind of always weird to think about. When we think about religion and religious groups, particularly here in the United States, we don't really think of them as institutions part of the government. They're not really, ordained by the president or Congress or anything like that. In Russia, they kind of are. These are de facto, and even kind of in many cases, actual people representing the Russian government. And part of their job is they're supposed to have control over religion in the country so that they can be giving out the Tsar's message. Well, if Joe Schmo all of a sudden says, I don't need you, I'm going to do Christianity on my own, and it's going to involve, sick guitar solos, getting drunk, and looking at crystals, well, hey, that's not good, because even if, maybe Joe's not going to hurt anybody, he's not getting the Tsar's word when he ought to be, even if maybe he does end up becoming an amazing Christian. Because, while of course the Russian Orthodox Church would, then and now, still argue that no, the most important thing is that you're a good Christian, well, they kind of maybe say a little bit after that, hush, hush, but also, you kind of got to just do what we say. That's really, really what this is about. But ultimately, the enforcement that the church would carry out would end up being not great. It wouldn't really do a whole lot. And in part of this is, as I said before, occult ideas mixed really well with Christian ones, and there wasn't a lot that they could really do to extricate the two once they were together. But also, this is because it was not just the peasant classes of Europe and the United States that were getting into the occult. Oh, much the contrary. Occultism was incredibly in vogue with the well-to-do. Hiring some weird lady from Philadelphia who's pretending to be from Romania to read your fortune? Well, that's not cheap. Like I was saying, these people aren't like, your kind of normal religious clerics or whatever, just kind of say, hey, I'm going to beg on the street, or the church will take care of me, or whatever. No. You want a palm reading? $5. You want to talk to grandpa? That'll be $15 a minute, whatever. These people are out to make money. And while their ideas do get spread around, and of course, as we can see now with the existence of occult ideas within our modern concepts of religion, they got spread to normal people as well. But really, this was a big deal in the wealthy circles. The occult quickly became a favorite pastime for those who could afford it. And mystics, spiritualists, and fortune tellers and soothsayers quickly became central figures in the social circles of wealthy people all over Europe and the United States. Another reason that occultism was particularly popular was that it dovetailed nicely in the rising sentiments of nationalism. I don't really know enough about why this is, but there is a really interesting correlation between nationalist and fascist movements and the occult. For example, look at the Nazis and their weird Odin shit. Or look at today in the United States and our right wing and their obsession with satanic cabals. In my mind, what it seems to me is that nationalists and fascists look to the past for their quote-unquote ancient identities. And paganism, as we've discussed a little bit before, is important to that identity. And like I said, what we discussed before is there's a certain pagan identity to spiritualism. Now, much like the kind of pagan identity of this spiritualism, it's not actual paganism, but it's kind of the modern concepts of what we think pagans are like. So, hearkening back to this time of, kind of quote-unquote pure cultural identity, that being old paganism ways, kind of makes sense if you're going to try to draw a line between these totally 100% actual pagan guaranteed rituals, citation needed, and these people who are really into paganism because they're like, well, that's the way of our ancestors. It also links back to the ancestors people are struggling with being in hell, and kind of fills in the gaps of how now millions of years the earth has been here and we didn't know about it. Maybe millions of years ago the Proto-Russians were using crystals to ward off evil spirits and commune with the dead. And since these Proto-Russians, of course, are the greatest people ever because we're, diehard Russian nationalists, we know they're not rotting in hell. We can talk to them right here with my Ouija board. So this is really just my guess at the end of the day. I am not an expert in this. I don't really know a whole lot about really right-wing movements, paganism, or spiritualism. But from what I do know, this is kind of my best guess on the matter. But I do know someone who likely would agree with me, at least on some of these points. And that person would be the Tsar. Tsar Nikolai II was an avid spiritualist, as well as his wife Alexandra. But the Tsar and Tsarina were also devoutly Orthodox, or at least seemingly were. But they blended the two together, kind of like I was explaining before. In fact, Tsar Nikolai saw a special spiritual connection between the Tsar and the Russian people. He saw himself as the father of all the Russian subjects, and in the early 1900s, he was trying really hard to foster that image, and to create a link between current 1900s Russia and medieval Russia, back when the Tsar was much more in control, and a time when things were, quote-unquote simpler, and the father Tsar would watch over his grateful children, rather than those children blowing the Tsar up with bombs. Not gonna lie, yeah, I kind of get why the Tsar wants to go back then. 1905, not a great time to be the Tsar. A specific example of Tsar Nikolai doing this whole kind of link to the past shit was in 1903, he ordered the canonization into sainthood of a man named Seraphim. Seraphim was a medieval religious figure who was incredibly anti-Western and pro-Russia. He was, coming at this time when a lot of the Tsars were saying, hey, the West is powerful, we want to be like them. And he said, no, we are going to find our strength through our identity as Russians. I reject all that shit. The Tsar seemingly wanted to create a link between himself and this important and famous religious figure as a way of stressing his commitment to Russian tradition and heritage. The Tsar seemingly saw a future of Russia in the past. And actually, there were a number of people who agreed with the Tsar and wanted a return to tradition, or what they of course conceived as tradition, because none of these people met Ivan the Terrible, and maybe if they had, they wouldn't be too keen on going back. Because really, at the end of the day, a lot of these fascist, nationalist, hyper-conservative movements, they're talking about times that they never lived in and that they don't understand. And, I could go on, but I'm really kind of sick and tired of people born in the 70s telling me about how great the 50s were. And that's a lot of what's going on here. But anyways, groups like the Black Hundreds carried out violent attacks in order to bolster the Tsar's control and to drive out those they saw as being counter to Russian identity and the Russian government. These people, when I say attacks, I mean literally knives, guns, bombs, whole 9 yards. Their biggest target was the Jews, who they accused of being the leaders of a secret cabal hell-bent on world domination and communism. If this sounds familiar to QAnon, then good, because there is nothing new under the sun. There's a reason I used the kind of modern American right wing as an example earlier. Fascism and occultism seem to go hand in hand for some reason. And back to kind of what we were talking about, after the revolution of 1905, the violence targeting people who were perceived as being quote-unquote un-Russian intensified, as did the Tsar's desire and attempt to create a spiritual link between him and his subjects. One such person who supported the Tsar in his, perceived spiritual connection with the Russian peasantry, mind you, a group of people who in about 14 years would murder him, was a man named Nizir Philippe, or generally just referred to as Philippe. Philippe was a French mystic and holy man who came to Russia and became incredibly close with the Tsar and Tsarina. Sound familiar? In particular, what drew them to him was that he promised to help them conceive a son, something they were having some particular difficulties pulling off. Daughters, they had in spades, but what can you even do with daughters? It's the early 1900s. You can't give them the empire. Come on, guys. Come on, it's silly. But in 1905, about 4 years after first meeting Philippe, they did have a son. This is 4 years of trying to conceive a child, so maybe it's just a numbers game here, but the Tsar and Tsarina said it was a sign from God, and it was a sign that Philippe got magic powers. But not everyone was as taken with Philippe as the Tsar and Tsarina. In particular, the Tsar's mother was not a fan of Philippe, seeing that he had quite a bit of control over her son, and she ultimately said, that's gotta stop. Some at court were also not particularly fans of Philippe, and it started being discussed, who might he be? The mother of the Tsar in particular thought that he was a Jewish spy who was trying to, undermine Russia. So again, really glad that everything has changed so much. But anyhow, in 1905, Philippe would die. The Tsar and Tsarina were absolutely fucking distraught. I mean, that was like their best friend. And actually, speaking of friend, they would often refer to him as our friend in their diaries. A term that would be used, kind of interchangeably maybe, with this new sick as fuck mystic on the block, some smelly, weird bearded dude from Siberia. Only a few months after Philippe had, bought the farm, Rasputin was sitting before the Tsar and Tsarina, right there at their table. And well, with the old guy out to pasture, bada boom, bada bing. Rasputin was in many ways exactly what the Tsar and Tsarina were looking for. He fit the bill basically perfectly. One, he's Orthodox. Not just Christian, he's Orthodox. And while there is some debate about this, particularly at the time of what kind of religion Rasputin is, he's Orthodox enough. He's from Russia. He's going to church. He's doing the church Slavonic shit. Man's Orthodox enough. Two, he's absolutely a mystic. And he believed in some weird stuff. His approach to Christianity was certainly unique, and there was a lot of talk that Rasputin had mystical powers, chiefly the ability to heal people, and Rasputin claimed to be able to remove people's sins, which the, kind of healing people stuff is definitely a little more mainstream Christianity, but the removal of sins, that's definitely out there. Third, he's a peasant, which really worked well for the Tsar's whole peasantry-Tsar linkage thing. Nothing like having a random peasant live with you and be a part of your inner circle to show people that you certainly did care about the little guy, even though, of course, the actual little guys were working 120-hour weeks for $3 a year. But hey, it's the image that matters. And fourth and finally, Rasputin was a monarchist, and a pretty damn big one. By all accounts, Rasputin believed deeply in the office of the Tsar in general, and in Nikolai personally. Rasputin basically immediately ingratiated himself with the Tsar and Tsarina and filled the spot that was left by Philippe. But it was not only the imperial family that welcomed Rasputin. As it turned out, that issue with people being unhappy with Christianity was something that the Russian aristocracy was really feeling. And a lot of people were really excited to have their own quote-unquote Eastern mystic man in their midst. In particular, he was a man who gave new and exciting concepts on what they saw as kind of old-school, stodgy Christianity. Particularly in Russia, there was a desire that many people had to reform the Orthodox Church and to kind of breathe new life into it. Much like the Tsar's government, a lot of people were not exactly happy with the backwards-minded, archaic traditionalist clergy. Rasputin and other radical members of the clergy were hyper-popular at this time, and they were seen as injecting new, fresh ideas into the stale, kind of traditional-minded Orthodox Church. But the mysticism that Rasputin brought to bear was not always a good thing. Particularly as time went on and Rasputin's haters became more numerous and outspoken, Rasputin began to find himself in a prophecy of sorts. Part of the obsession with occultism in Russia was that there was a strong undercurrent of fear and anxiety for the future of Russia. A number of people within the church and Russian high society saw the new occult influences as the work of the devil, and there was a belief that within Russia, the devil was at work to undermine the church and the Tsar, and ultimately destroy, the whole Russian Empire. Rasputin also kind of fit this bill perfectly too. He was an outsider who did not fit the mold of the Russian aristocracy. Rather, he was a peasant, like the people who had arisen in 1905 and had clawed power away from the Tsar. He was a mystic man from the East who the dignified St. Petersburg elite saw as uncultured, unrefined, and quote-unquote Asiatic. Their word, not mine. And Rasputin quickly ingratiated himself with the Tsar and seemed to have a decent amount of sway on not only the Tsar, but also the Tsarina and a number of other powerful and influential religious and court figures. Quickly, people started to associate him with the Khristi, an accusation he would never really seem to shake, and one we've already seen made before. And now, mind you, the Khristi was a group that the aristocrats of St. Petersburg likely would never have actually met anyone from, but almost certainly would know all the sordid tales about them and all their heresies and debaucheries, as well as their links to the Old Believers, an Orthodox splinter group that was known for its open contempt for the Tsar and the Russian Orthodox Church, as well as its involvement in a number of insurgencies and rebellions directly aimed at the Tsar. So, in other words, Rasputin fit all these concerns to a T. But in 1905, when Rasputin first hit the scenes, these concerns were mostly sidelined. For now. Whether loved or hated, he was definitely a hot commodity. Everyone wanted to meet this guy. He was a real kind of showstopper. People saw him and went nuts. Even if they hated him, they just had to talk to him because he was the hot man on the scene. And there was no middle ground on that. You either loved the man or you hated him. There didn't seem to be a lot of indifference in respect to Rasputin. He was someone that, like I said, everyone needed to know because they were either going to love him to death or they were going to, want to murder him to death. So now that we know a little bit about kind of where he fit in, let's find out more about how he kind of got on in St. Petersburg high society. Let's talk a little bit about kind of who was Rasputin at a personal level. By all accounts, the man was a charmer. He was apparently to some so charming it was could not be handled, or he was so kind of, fast-talking lawyer guy that it drove people up a wall. But to be fair to him, he was a well-traveled man, and he was quick to tell people about the interesting places he'd been, and he had a lot of really neat and interesting connections. He was seemingly very into God, and he was quick to condemn the wealthy of St. Petersburg for their sins, which a number of people that he met with were also communists and social democrats and not exactly big fans of everything going on, so, that did win some people over there, but also some people who were very much so established in the monarchy really were like, hell yeah, man, give it to us. Which, I guess you would be a pretty shitty holy man if you walked into, literal opulence and wealth beyond your wildest dreams, and then you went, yeah, everything looks cool here, this all checks out. So, some people did kind of like it when he came in and just shit on their style. And everyone, I mean everyone, from his greatest enemies to his most loyal friends, remarked how absolutely captivating his eyes were. They were described as burning with passion, and some even said that they glowed. I know this is incredibly dramatic. I know that this sounds insane. I just spent the first half of this episode shitting on mysticism and spiritualism and magic and all of that. But this is straight up what everyone says. People could not stop talking about his eyes. I am dead serious here. But some people, other than the eyes thing, because even the people who hated him straight up are he smells like shit and his eyes glows like fire. Weird. But anyways. Now, some people saw all of this as an act. They saw it as, oh, he's some upstart peasant and he wants to get in big with all the rich guys and whatever. But then some people actually really believed him. Some people really took his insights into religion and they said, yeah, that sounds like God to me. But overall, he made a splash, whatever can be said, one way or another. In particular, he did so with the ladies. But we will talk about that more because Rasputin would not stay in the capital for very long. Not long after meeting the Tsar, he went home to Pokrovskaya, And on the way back, he wrote to the Tsar with an interesting request. This isn't super important, but I don't know. I do kind of find it interesting. He requested that the Tsar change his last name. And the Tsar said, sure, why the fuck not? From that day on, Grigory Rasputin would become known as Grigory Novoy. Novoy meaning new in Russian. I'm not entirely sure why he decided to get the name change, but he did, and clearly it didn't do all too much for Rasputin because he still usually referred to himself by Rasputin, and sometimes he'd even hyphenate the two last names as Rasputin Novoy, which means new Rasputin, so I don't know. But after this name change, Rasputin's stay in Pokrovskaya would not be for very long. He mostly just kind of stayed, helped with the harvest, and then dipped. He would continue to bounce around Russia, particularly between St. Petersburg and Pokrovskaya. A kind of interesting aside about his travels was that one time he stayed with a wealthy family in Kazan, and they give us an interesting little insight into what they thought of him. They first and foremost did say that he was an interesting person, but they complained a lot about his table manners. They were not exactly keen on this stinky peasant man coming into their house and behaving like, well, a stinky peasant man. Apparently, they thought he was gross, and they found him to be really unpleasant because apparently he would brush his hair and beard at the dinner table. I don't know, this doesn't really tell us a whole lot, but I guess it kind of does add a little bit of context that some of his detractors, particularly within the wealthy circles, probably just didn't really like him because he was a peasant hanging in these areas. And I think that will become maybe a little bit more important later, and we'll discuss my opinions on why people didn't like him at the very end. But I think this is really interesting to kind of point out that there's this very clear instance where they did like him. By all means, it seems that they thought he was interesting, but they thought he was just too peasant. He was kind of too gross, and ultimately that turned them off from him. But now that we have that kind of slice of life thing out of the way, we got to talk about a very, very important thing that happened. There was something particularly important going on within the imperial court that Rasputin would be central to. And this would be the Tsarevich Alexei. Tsarevich is basically the guy who's going to take over for the Tsar. This is the Tsar's inheritor, his son. So remember from earlier in the episode, Alexei, the one and only son and inheritor of the entire Russian Empire, was someone that was brought into this world surrounded by the Tsar and Tsarina's obsession with the occult. They attributed his conception and his birth, something that they had had a lot of very serious trouble pulling off, to the powers of Philippe, their previous weird magic man. Alexei was born in 1905, and now in the world, his parents would have some issues kind of keeping him that way. In particular, the number one issue that vexed the young Alexei was that he was a hemophiliac. In 1907, at only a few years old, Alexei would fall and injure his leg. The actual proper doctors checked on Alexei and said that there was nothing that they could do, that basically he would live or he wouldn't. But as the story goes, Rasputin was there to save the day. Rasputin was called upon, and he stayed at the foot of Alexei's bed all night and prayed over the injured child, and in the morning, Alexei was fine. This is in many ways a bit of an urban legend and has been passed along, over the last roughly 100 years, 100 or more so years, and various details have been added, removed, and changed. But at the end of the day, pretty much everyone both then and now all have to kind of deal with the fact that no one knows how, but seemingly Rasputin saved Alexei from his hemophilia. Now, it's not just this one time too. There are going to be other times. Though, don't get me wrong, I don't actually think that Rasputin prayed to God and saved the child. But that is exactly how the Tsar and Tsarina saw it. To them, that was exactly what happened. In reality, like I said, we don't actually know. No one really knows for sure. And it kind of has to, like I said, deal with the fact that normal medicine failed. Rasputin came in and things seemed to get better. But in reality, probably what happened is it's 1907 and medicine was not super good at the time. And basically the doctors were likely poking and prodding the boy as opposed to leaving him be so that his injuries could heal. Once they gave up and said, well, he'll live or he won't, and left, that's when he was able to heal on his own. It just so happens that Rasputin comes in and stays with him the whole night. That likely if Rasputin had not come in, he would have been fine. But, as I said, what's really more important here is that the Tsar and Tsarina saw, well, exactly that. They saw the doctors leave and they say, sorry, there's nothing we can do. Your son's probably not going to make it. This dude comes in, prays over him, and bada boom, bada bing, kid's fine in the morning. And well, as you might imagine, since he is the guy who just saved the life of their son, Rasputin is immediately ingratiated in their circle to like the highest degree. It's actually not the highest degree, somehow he does get closer with them, but pretty much just like boom, right there. You are now a super close friend of the Tsar. Congratulations. From this point on, Rasputin would be so closely linked to the Tsar and Tsarina that he could just roll up to the palace and he'd be let in, like without an invitation or appointment or even just a small heads up. In a way, he kind of started becoming a family member of the royal family. But it is also important to point out that Rasputin was making enemies just about as quickly as he was making friends. And for the first time, though certainly not the last time, those enemies were going to try to do something about the bearded weirdo that was lurking in the halls of the Winter Palace. In 1906, the Russian government opened an investigation on Rasputin. Why? No one really knows. Who started it? No one really knows that either. But seemingly, someone was starting to take issue with the royal family's new friend. How this played out was that the government in St. Petersburg reached out to local authorities in Pokrovskaya, and they asked them to spy on Rasputin and to try to build a case against him. The local authorities said that was pretty dumb and they weren't going to fucking do that. So they figured it out because they couldn't really just send back to St. Petersburg like, no, fuck you, we're not doing it. Instead, the local authorities kind of shirked their responsibilities onto a local bishop and said, hey man, this is stupid, you do it. And they put in charge of the investigation a man named Bishop Antony. And believe it or not, Antony also thought this was pretty fucking dumb. But much like the local authorities who couldn't tell the higher-ups in St. Petersburg to, go kick rocks, Antony couldn't really either. So, observe Rasputin he did. And on September 1st, 1907, Antony sent a report on Rasputin to his superiors in the local government. And as it turns out, Antony maybe misjudged his assignment at first because he had some interesting things to say. First and foremost, he pegged Rasputin as a member of the Khristi. And really, that's kind of what this whole investigation, if not what it started out as, it's what it becomes. This whole thing is basically, we think Rasputin's a Christ, and we need information, we need proof, we need something to prove that, because the Khristi are seen as kind of enemies of the state, at least of the church, and well, the church is running this investigation now, and if they can prove that he is a Christ, that would be incredibly damning, and they may even be able to take certain amounts of, legal action against the man. So, as I said, first and foremost, he is saying that Rasputin is a Christ. He even went so far as to say that Rasputin was somehow affiliated with the leaders of the Khristi, which, that's pretty big if true, and it would make Rasputin an incredibly wanted individual by the Russian Orthodox Church, and someone that even maybe the Russian secular government might be interested in, getting rid of. Then, Antony went on to bring up Rasputin's most famous and prevalent accusations, one that people still know him for today, his sexual proclivities, which, real quick, one of the things that's kind of interesting, and like I said, we will talk a lot more about kind of Rasputin's legacy and my personal opinions on him at the very end of this series, but a little aside right quick, one of the interesting things about Rasputin and a lot of the investigations that are going to be taken against him is they're not really interested in kind of his sexual proclivities, maybe his more not so great actions and his not so great connections, not as that they themselves matter, but actually just that they are proof that he's a Khristi. That's really all that matters. And Rasputin will do some really not so great stuff that really should be addressed on its own. But no one's actually interested in any of that. No one's interested in holding Rasputin to task for what he does. They just want to get him for being a Christ, because that's really what's important to the Russian government. Not, oh man, Rasputin's a kind of weird sex pest going out and doing bad stuff, just that, hey, he might have the wrong ideas about Jesus. But I've digressed. back to what I was talking about. Antony remarked that a number of women had moved in with Rasputin. These were almost all wealthy women and were from all over Russia, and they'd come to be with Rasputin for spiritual guidance. Antony states that Rasputin would often touch and even kiss these women, and that that Rasputin would do this in public view of everyone. And apparently this touchiness was not only proof of his sexual depravity to Antony, but also was a sign of him being a theist. To get this information, Antony watched Rasputin and his actions, as well as interviewed a number of people within Pokrovskaya, and he found out that they too had noticed the strange behaviors of Rasputin, and were concerned that he was a member of the Khristi, and that he was doing weird sex stuff with these fancy ladies. But there is a problem with this report. Although these accusations did seem to line up with the assumptions that many people held about Rasputin, seemingly the entire report was mostly based off the assumptions of Bishop Antony rather than any hard and fast proof. And Bishop Antony kind of just admitted as much. In Antony's own words, Antony says upon meeting Rasputin that I was struck by his extremely emaciated face, with its sunken and sickly burning eyes, by his sham endearing manner of speech full of diminutives and pet names so common to the sectarian. Basically, he met Rasputin face to face like once, and then just decided he sucked. Which, now to be fair, he has clearly kind of followed the guy around and has seen some things, but it would appear that he's kind of painting it as the worst possible stuff, because he met him, decided he sucked, and said, well, time to send this off. And even the people that he did talk to also kind of seemed to have a bit of a chip on their shoulder. As time went on, Rasputin got less and less popular in Pokrovskaya. Upon returning with the favor of the Tsar and many, many other wealthy people, Rasputin himself started to gather some pretty serious wealth, and he flaunted this money pretty openly. He used his newfound cash to buy a bigger house for him and his family, and also a place for him to do his religious services within the house. So this is a big house. He did ultimately try to build that church in Pokrovskaya, though this was actually really unpopular within Pokrovskaya, because they already had a church, and they weren't interested in Rasputin coming in with his, funny money and building them another one. As well, he was surrounded by fancy, wealthy women who he'd come and somehow, courted, if not necessarily maybe explicitly in a sexual way, but with his religious powers, that he's gotten attracted to himself, and he's got them living with him, and they're taking care of him and all this other stuff. And I have to imagine that some of the people in Pokrovskaya were likely jealous of this. But this is also not to say that Bishop Antony's findings were entirely without merit. He did find some pretty fucking damning stuff. In particular, he read the testimony of a woman named Elizaveta Kazakova, who she had sent him this because she knew about the investigation and wanted to tell her story. Elizaveta said that Rasputin came to her at her sister's funeral and offered her spiritual guidance. She claims that he told her he was gathering up a group of young women to come with him to a local bathhouse so he could deliver them what he called, quote-unquote, full repentance. Believe it or not, she turned down his offer. And then she started doing some digging of her own on Rasputin. She asked people around town about him and heard some pretty distressing things. She heard that Rasputin was a womanizer, and that he told the women in his group that he could teach them to control their desires by basically molesting them until they got used to it. Elizaveta then confronted Rasputin about this, and he more or less admitted to it. He told her that he was like a heat sink for their sins, and that he would take their sins off their hands through these actions, and basically somehow, by being a weirdo at them, he could remove their sins from them. Elizaveta apparently found this explanation to be good enough for her to start hanging around Rasputin and his crowd, though she was quickly turned off from the group. She said that the group was a bunch of high society ladies who were bored and repressed in the capital, so they latched onto this exciting, charming man from far, far away. Elizaveta wrote all this down in a letter and sent it to Bishop Antony with the express goal of sparing any other women from falling victim to Rasputin. Now, I think this goes without saying, that's pretty fucking gross. And as you might imagine, Rasputin decried the investigation as a witch hunt and said that the entire investigation and the accusations against him were not based in reality, but were based in jealousy and were trying to discredit him for flaunting his wealth. And to be fair, I don't think he's entirely wrong. I'm going to go on record and say that I believe Yelizaveta Kazakova, and I'm going to say that she's absolutely telling the truth. And I think a lot of people in Pokrovskaya had very real issues with the man. But I also think they would be losing quite a bit of context to just gloss over the fact that this man straight up left his tiny Siberian village a few years ago and then came back loaded down with money like a Spanish galleon, and was now best friends with the Tsar and all the Tsar's friends. And that probably made a lot of people who were stuck in said tiny Siberian village a little bit jealous. But my opinion aside, the local authorities received Antony's report and they came to a similar conclusion. They thought there was something here, but they needed more proof so they could really nail Rasputin down. So, a new investigation was started, and this time the investigation would be headed by a man named Father Gluchovtsev, which, sorry if that's kind of weird, I don't know, it sounds weird coming out of my mouth, I don't know how it sounds in the mic, but get used to hearing Gluchovtsev, because he's a pretty integral part of the last, 10-15 minutes of this. So, Gluchovtsev picked up pretty much doing exactly what Antony was doing. But this time, Gluchovtsev was not going to just interview some random people or wait for testimony to come in. No. Gluchovtsev was on the warpath, and he was ready to turn over every single stone and gather every piece of information so that he could nail Rasputin to the fucking floor. This strategy started by Gluchovtsev interviewing the local churchmen in Pokrovskaya, and they pretty much all agreed that they liked Rasputin. Most of the anti-Rasputin churchmen were seemingly in the surrounding area and not in Pokrovskaya itself. The churchmen of Pokrovskaya said that Rasputin wasn't a theist and that he followed all the standard church doctrine and observed all the standard Orthodox holidays and traditions. And again, I need to point out, this investigation isn't, is Rasputin like a sex pest? Is Rasputin a rapist? Is Rasputin really a bad guy? It's, is Rasputin a theist? Is he practicing religion correctly? So, that's why he goes to the churchmen first. But quickly Gluchovtsev started hearing more concerning tales from the women of Pokrovska, who told stories of Rasputin being a general creep and trying to constantly kiss them even when they rejected his advances. With this information in hand, Gluchovtsev gathered together the village elder, a village constable, and 3 peasant witnesses and did a little search of Rasputin's house. As part of their search, Gluchovtsev conducted interviews of the Rasputin family and their house guests. The women staying with Rasputin and his family said that Rasputin did kiss them, but they found it no more weird than how people in the cities kiss each other, and when they greet each other and part. They said it was fairly platonic. Though, a quick aside here. I'm trying hard to not interject my opinions into each little point here, but I think there is some important context that needs to be discussed here. While it is true that in St. Petersburg at the time, it was common to kiss people as a form of greeting people and when saying goodbye. But a lot of people in St. Petersburg also noted how weird it was that Rasputin was so kissy and touchy. And also some said that they kind of chalked it up to, oh, well, he's from the hinterlands, and that must be how they do it there. So, seemingly, it's not as pedestrian as the ladies living with Rasputin would have had Gluchovtsev believe. But anyways, Gluchovtsev also interviewed Rasputin's wife. She claimed that nothing weird was going on. She claimed that Rasputin was a good Christian and not doing any weird stuff with their house guests. She also told Gluchovtsev that she had been with Rasputin a number of times on his trips to the capital and that everything was above board. And lastly, and this is my favorite, Gluchovtsev interviewed Rasputin's father, a man named Yefim Rasputin. Apparently, Papa Rasputin was completely checked out of whatever the fuck was going on with his son. His official testimony boils down to basically, I don't know what the hell he does. He's always gone off to pray to God or something. So, with the more aggressive investigation of Gluchovtsev concluded, and Rasputin now sweating bullets about his seeming impending doom as Father Gluchovtsev sent off this report, on January 10th, 1908, the investigators at a local theological college, which the mere concept of religious school cops scares the shit out of me, started discussing Gluchovtsev's report. But seemingly, a surprise to everyone, Rasputin included, Gluchovtsev's ultimate report said that the investigation was inconclusive. At the end of the day, the investigation like I said, was only about finding out if Rasputin was a Christ. That was it, and Gluchovtsev had no definitive proof of that. He said that Rasputin and his followers were certainly a bit out there, but as far as the church was concerned, they weren't, doing anything wrong, at least not anything that he had hard proof of. He also went ahead and dropped a pretty big bombshell on the whole thing and said basically, I don't know if I'm actually the right guy for this because I'm not really an expert on cults or religious sects. Which is pretty fucking nuts because Gluchovtsev replaced Father Antony. He's the guy that they called in to do, the second level of this. But, so at the end, much like at Antony's end of his report, he says, I think you guys should get somebody who's a little bit better at this than me and continue, because much like Antony, he said, there is something going on here. This guy is weird, and things are happening, but I don't have any definitive proof. So, much like after Antony gave his little dissertation, this time, though with the power of the Sunday school prefects at hand, I'm not even kidding, straight up, the local seminary college is providing Sunday school cops to look up Rasputin, they start another investigation. But in May of 1908, only 4 months after the most recent investigation had ended, the church once again had nothing solid to stick on Rasputin, and once again further investigation was called for. But since the third time apparently is not the charm, or as the Russian saying goes, Bog troitsu lubit, which the loose translation means third time is the charm, there would be no fourth go-around. Much like the mysterious circumstances under which this investigation began, the investigation ended abruptly without any real clarification or explanation. Also much like the beginning of the investigation, it is believed that the investigation ended because of the powers that be in St. Petersburg. No one really knows for sure who stopped the investigation or why, but it seems very likely that either the churchmen in St. Petersburg or the Tsar, or both of them in tandem, somehow learned about the investigation and brought it to a close. While it's not clear who first learned of the investigation or who ultimately pulled the plug, it does seem clear that the Tsar and the church were at least somewhat aware. That is because shortly after the inconclusive May investigation, Rasputin returned to St. Petersburg and was pretty much immediately commanded by the Tsarina Alexandra to return to Pokrovskaya with Feofan, Rasputin's buddy from the Lavra monastery, and conduct an investigation of their own. And, as you might imagine, Feofan returned to the Tsarina and said, yeah, everything's cool here, and she was satisfied with that. That, well, case is closed, Rasputin's cool, and everyone kind of needs to stop looking into it. Though, spoiler alert, this would not be the last investigation into the man. And with that, Rasputin survives his first brush with the powers that be that wanted him to, be somewhere else. But the cavalcade of investigations would seemingly boost Rasputin more than it would tear him down. Because the whole saga did not happen in private. No, the whole thing was being reported on by the Russian newspapers. Rasputin quickly was becoming a household name, and the people of Russia were really intrigued in this weird Siberian mystic who had the ear of the Tsar and Tsarina. But that is where we're going to have to leave it for today. So, do tune in next time for the deepening of the scandal as Rasputin takes center stage in Russian politics and in the imaginations of people all over Russia. As always, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, please leave me a comment as it helps me make the show better, and it does make the algorithm happy, which, of course, is always a good thing. But, all in all, thank you all for listening. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you for the next one. Bye-bye.